Thank you everyone for joining us and for on this particularly pleasant day today. We are all here today to answer the question, how do we unleash the potential of law tech and innovation to benefit all? I'm Kate Briscoe, Legal Services Board Member and co-founder of Legal Beagles, which is the UK's busiest free legal advice forum. This means that I am passionate about both access to justice and technology, which are some of the principal reasons I chose to join the LSB earlier this year. Therefore, this event is of particular fascination to me personally, and I'm thrilled to host this discussion to examine how technology is impacting the world of law. As the oversight regulator, the Legal Services Board's overarching mission is to reshape legal services to better meet the needs of society. Can embracing tech solutions into legal practice improve access to justice and create better services? And if so, what is the role of regulation in creating this new environment? We're here today to look at the findings of the LSB's latest research on levels of innovation and technology in law firms. The last few years have certainly shown a step up in response to the challenges presented by COVID-19. And as they say, necessity is the mother of all invention, or innovation in this case. But we are still a long way off seeing the revolutionary impact that technology can have on a sector, as seen in banking and financial services. Is the legal services sector ready to embrace AI, predictive technology, and automation? Joining me today is Research Manager Tom May, who is going to take us through the insights from the research, Policy Manager Lorena Esposito-Story, who will outline the LSB's position on developing policy guidance for technology in legal services, David Abbott from the Legal Services Consumer Panel to give a consumer perspective on the opportunities and pitfalls of lawyers embracing technological change. And we're also being joined by award-winning lawyer and tech expert Jenifer for the discussions. But before I invite Tom and Lorena to take us through the research findings and our work from here, I'd like to ask all of you joining us on this session today, how confident are you about the future of technology and innovation in legal services for better legal services for everyone? We're going to have a poll function here, and we'd like to hear your feedback on how you're feeling about the adoption of tech in legal services. Please could you all make a selection and press which one you feel most represents your view, and we'll have a little look at what that shows from the audience view. Yeah, it's coming up shortly. Oh, that's nice to see. 48% of you on this meeting are very confident, 30% are unsure, and 22% not confident. Yeah, I think that's very aligned with some of what we're going to be seeing in the research. I'm sure Tom will mention that when he comes on to that. But it's really good to see that a majority of the people actually on this call, I mean, I would hope we're all fairly confident that it can do some promising things, but that's good to see. Thank you everyone for voting. So we will also be answering your questions after the presentations. So please feel free to type any questions you've got about Tom or Lorena's presentations on the research findings and the policy guidance into the Q&A sector. And we will then upload those for after the presentations to have a little chat about. But for the time being, let's hand over to Tom to present his most recent research findings on technology and innovation in law. Thanks, Tom.
Lovely. Thanks, Kate. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Hopefully, you can now see as it comes through the first slide. So if you can't, do shout in the Q&A. But otherwise, I shall assume that it's all good, and we shall keep going. My name's Tom. I'm the research manager at the LSB, and shortly I'll hand over to Lorena as well. Two bits here. We're going to take you through the highlights, and then onto the policy side, and the consultation that we currently have running on our draft guidance to promote the use of technology and innovation. As Kate has said, any questions as we go through, please do type them into the Q&A function, and we'll very happily go into those as soon as we've been through this bit here. So this is the third wave of the use of technology and innovation survey that we've run here at the LSB. And as you can see, obviously the first one since 2020, where we went through the pandemic, finally leaving the EU, and then subsequently that increasing cost of living that we see right now. Ironically, for a survey on innovation and technology, we run it as a telephone survey rather than as an online survey, and that helps us get more completions and therefore better data. We've got in total, as you can see, just over 1,300 responses, and that's sampled and weighted to be representative of the legal services providers across England and Wales. Mainly regulated, but we do have in there 150 unregulated as well. Now, as a longitudinal survey, one of the things we have to strike a balance on is keeping the measures the same so we can measure that change, but also keeping the measures relevant and adapting over time. So one of the big changes we see here is looking at the links to the pandemic and associated restrictions and leaving the EU and then increasing cost of living. Technologies themselves and their use and prominence have also changed. So back in 2018, we had these top 3 bundled all together of e-signatures and email security and ID checking tools. We've separated those out this time round. And back in 2018, we didn't ask about video conferencing because who thought that would be important or at all useful or even central to the way that we might deliver legal services and get to customers and clients and service users. What we see, all 3 of these, cost of living, leaving the EU and the pandemic, they've all driven increased use. But it's the pandemic that's been the real driver that we can see. So nearly a third say that it's increased their use of technology and innovation a lot. And 4 in 10 say it's increased it a little bit. It's not all one way, but you can see the net effect overwhelmingly. It's driving increased use. And as we see increased use, we see increased trust in that technology within each organisation as well. Across the board, but again, most notably with the pandemic, almost a fifth, 18% say their views are a lot more positive, and then double that at nearly 4 in 10 saying it a little bit more positive. Again, not entirely one way, but the net effect is very, very clear. Now, this is probably the slide that you're probably most interested in. So we see along the bottom here the 13 technologies that we asked about. And then the darker purple, that is firms or organisations that were currently using it when we asked them. And then the lighter colour, the lighter purple, are those who are planning to use it in the next 3 years. And we can see video conferencing very much leading the way in the most use, down at this end of the scale or the chart, where not obviously law tech and perhaps not necessarily that most advanced or sophisticated in terms of technology, compared to this end, where more obviously about law tech, more chance or opportunity you can see or use for artificial intelligence, but much lower take up. Though notably, planning wise, still over 10% say they're looking to use these within the next 3 years. But it's the bit in the middle that's the most interesting. You see here, most of these have got a little asterisk above them, denoting that they are what we're calling technologies for access. So this is anything that means that you don't have to be at a certain place at a certain time to meet a certain person, probably with a certain document. And that can make life easier, certainly for users and consumers. You know, you don't have to travel, you don't have to take time off work, etc., etc. There's also an opportunity there for providers as well, because there's then the chance to scale without having to add the same number of staff or humans to do those jobs, to get that further reach and potentially to grow and to serve more customers. Of course, the next thing that's interesting after knowing what's being used is when it was started to be used. And we can see down this end on the right-hand side of the chart, again, dominated by those technologies for access, especially video conferencing. So you can see that the dark blue is autumn 2019 or earlier. That lighter purple, that's from autumn 2019, so just before the pandemic, and then over the height of the pandemic and the associated restrictions. And then the lighter greys dropping off from the peak of the pandemic to, dare I say it, perhaps getting into post-pandemic territory. But you can see with the video conferencing, yes, 1/3 we're using before, but then we've got a third over the height and then another third post. Real growth, and similar with live chat or virtual assistants and custom built apps. And less so, but still you can see significant more recent take up for the likes of electronic signatures and ID checking tools. So this is where we get a sense of what's been started to be used when. Now, looking at the changes over time, actually, when we look at investing in new or improved services compared to 2018, that's decreased by seven percentage points. And we think that's probably because organizations have been focusing on just delivering the things that they're trying to already have going rather than going bigger or better. But when we look at the technologies, it's slightly nuanced. So it's hard to get the exact measure of change, but we can see that there is an increase. If we look at those same 10 categories from 2018 to 2022, there's a slight change, but it's not statistically significant. But then when we look at when people introduce something, so at least one of those 13, 6 in 10 have done that in the last 3 years. And then you see the massive use of video conferencing, 80%, where 2/3 of that have been from autumn 19 or more recently. We can also look at the rate of use in each firm, and that's increased. So firms that were using technology in 2018, they're using more of it now, 10 percentage point increase. And as you can see from those earlier charts, a lot of that increase has come from those technologies that can help make access more easy. Now, I've talked about all the things that are promoting or driving use of technology. Of course, it's not all one way, and there are those constraints or those drag factors. Now, when it comes to new services, regulatory factors are the biggest thing. 8% say it's a significant constraint, and just over a quarter say it's a small constraint. When we dug into that a little bit more and asked for exactly what was constraining or slowing, it seems that perception, there's a role here. And while some would point to GDPR and others one or two other things, actually it was quite hard for people in the survey to say and point something concrete to the actual regulation or set of regulations that were stopping them doing a certain thing. So yes, there's some concrete barriers, but also some perception there as well. When we look at the introduction of new technologies, however, regulation in terms of legal services is at the bottom of the pile. Still there, but it's the smallest thing. Instead, actually, it's much more around the lack of knowledge, money, and going into the unknown. And this is where, again, we're interested in looking to achieve with the guidance, balancing the benefits with the potential risks, both for individual users or potential users and customers, but also for that wider public good and benefit. As we've seen from, as I said at the beginning, increased use, increased trust, but also decreasing perceptions that there are those barriers and they're a real constraint on introducing things. Regulatory factors has seen the lowest drop, but still some 9 percentage points when it comes to introducing new or improved services. When it comes to technology, though, it's dramatic. Some 26 percentage point drop between 2018 and 2022. So you can see increased use, increased trust, decreasing barriers or real constraints. So when we step back and look at all that, we can see that the potential, not only, but especially those technologies for access that help it make it easier to avoid having to be at that certain place at that certain time, to meet that person with the right documents, etc., etc. to really help potentially scale up and increase access to legal services and therefore justice. And that's something that Lorena will be talking to shortly. Overall, not yet a revolution, but certainly a step change. And you can see from some of the comments here, you know, those who try it, they start to see the benefits. And I particularly see here that middle quote where they can get that further reach in ways that they never would have been able to prior to more traditional, purely face-to-face, purely paper-based ways of working and doing business. So yeah, so we see a dramatic change, if not an overall revolution. I'll now hand over to Lorena, who will take us through everything on the consultation and the guidance side.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. We just wanted to take this opportunity today to give you all a brief overview of our proposals to publish new guidance related to promoting the use of technology and innovation with the ultimate aim of improving access to legal services. So why are we looking to publish new guidance at this point? And essentially, it builds on the evidence base that the LSB has pulled together over the last few years, which recognises the transformative potential of technology for improving access to services, but also the role that regulation has in unlocking those benefits for users and providers alike. So what does the evidence tell us? Well, broadly, it tells us that consumers, both individuals and businesses, are open to using technology in accessing legal services and are aware of the benefits of using it, and increasingly, as Tom's slides show, are expecting it to be used. Legal professionals, in turn, are responding to this positively by using and supporting the use of tech and innovation, in particular those technologies for access, such as video conferencing. More broadly, the evidence also highlights the benefits that technology can bring. To name a few, the provision of more diverse and cost-effective services, the provision of more affordable services, which obviously have a benefit for the end consumer, services that are more responsive to client needs, and improved communication between lawyers and consumers. Despite this openness to use and the recognition of the benefits it can bring, the data on technology take-up and service offerings does actually show that there is still more scope for greater adoption of use of technology and innovation in the sector. And it also shows us that there are barriers to adoption that can affect consumers, professionals, and innovators that we believe and hope that regulation can help to address. And that brings us very neatly on to why we are providing the guidance. Sorry, Tom, would you mind slipping back to the previous slide? Thank you. So in terms of the guidance, its overall aim, as you can see there, is to promote the adoption of technology and innovation to improve access to services and build on the momentum and drive forward that momentum that the pandemic created. The guidance clarifies our expectations of what we think regulators should be working towards and encourages them to develop their regulatory approaches around 3 key outcomes, which we believe will help create a pro-innovation regulatory environment that promotes the use of technology and innovative solutions for consumer benefit, but also help to address the issues and the barriers that hamper the adoption of tech. In terms of the features of the guidance, so in line with our normal regulatory approach, it's non-prescriptive. It's based around 3 key outcomes, as I said, and we think that outcomes-based approach is the right one. It allows flexibility and recognises the diversity of the sector, allowing regulators to develop their individual regulatory approaches that work for their regulated communities and the consumers that they serve. Also, the guidance is deliberately technology neutral. The reasons for this are twofold. The first being it allows the guidance to remain flexible as developments occur. It also means that the guidance doesn't preclude regulators from publishing or issuing specific guidance on specific technologies such as AI, for example, if that's required. Next slide, please, Tom. So just to go back to those 3 outcomes, they focus very much on regulation being a positive enabling factor. and developing regulatory frameworks related to technology and innovation that, as per outcome 1, are consumer focused, putting consumers at the heart of the policy, supporting consumers to access legal services and meet their legal needs. Outcome 2 relates to following a risk-based approach, looking for solutions that can benefit consumers while being aware of and mitigating for risks, but not allowing them to become obstacles to adoption. And outcome 3 is very much outward looking to those technology providers and innovators who are looking to enter the market and looking to address and lower the barriers that they might face. Next slide, please, Tom. And in terms of where we are in next steps, so the consultation is currently live. It closes on the 2nd of October, and we very much welcome all and any responses, and do feel free to comment on the guidance and the consultation in the chat in the Q&A function during the discussion. Once the consultation is closed, we'll review and consider the responses that we've received before we finalise the guidance, which will then need to be approved by our board. And the aim is for us to publish that final guidance early next year. So with that, I'll stop and hand back to Kate.
Thank you so much, Tom and Lorena. Really interesting. I mean, it is really interesting to see that even if actual practice hasn't changed in some areas, the appetite to adopt more technological practices has certainly increased since COVID. Tom, the data is giving us a better understanding of attitudes across the sector, but are there differences in terms of the responses between different types of provider?
Yes, absolutely. I think the first group that very much stand out are the ABS structured firms. They're more likely to be offering online services, more likely to be developing significantly new or improved services, and they were more likely, compared to everybody as a whole, introduced 9 out of the 13 technologies we asked about. So yes, you know, you always hear about ABS being an important thing. This illustrates why you have some of that excitement.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point actually on ABS. And David, thank you very much for joining us to give us your views from a consumer perspective. How much do you see the take-up of technologies for access helping to increase access to legal services? And also, please do tell us a little bit about your role on the Legal Services Consumer Panel at the same time.
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. It's really great to be invited to join this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm one of the 8 members of the Legal Services Consumer Panel. We are appointed under the Legal Services Act to act as independent advisors, really, to the board and to the wider legal sector. We represent consumer interests in the legal services sector. So I think it's right to say that for the panel, unmet legal need is really the top of our agenda. We're extremely concerned about a lack of access to services due to their unavailability, so-called advice deserts, unaffordability for various factors, and also barriers to accessing existing services. So even where there is provision, kind of getting into it is sometimes difficult. That may be due to a lack of knowledge, perceptions of cost, or really just generally inadequate information about services. So for the panel, technology therefore has a really important part to play in connecting consumers to the services that exist, extending the reach of those services, so to get over geographical boundaries and issues, helping services to fit into busy lives, and improving the efficiency and reducing the cost of services. And I think probably just one note of caution, which is that digitally excluded people are amongst the most marginalised in society, and so we wouldn't therefore be looking to see the sector put all its eggs into the digital basket. And there's actually some really interesting research that was published last week actually by the SRA, which was looking to segment consumers of legal services and kind of understand, gaining insight into their attitudes and behaviours. And I think one of the things that showed us is that for some people, their preference is maybe accessing services by technology. For others, it isn't. It absolutely isn't. Face-to-face is their necessity. But it's very hard to segment them in the traditional sort of sense. So it's not to do necessarily with kind of ethnicity or the kind of socio-economic factors, but there are just different preferences for people, and so it's really important therefore that the sector has a variety of provision to meet everybody's needs.
Yeah, it's a really good point actually about the sort of those in society who don't have access to digital connections. For those that do, though, do you think consumer expectations around expecting to use technology to access their lawyers have changed? Have become the norm?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the context for that and our ability to speak with authority about that is that we run something we call the Consumer Tracker Survey. We've been running this survey since 2012. It's the only large-scale longitudinal study of consumer attitudes and experiences. So we've got an enormous amount of data now for over a decade. We're interviewing 3,500 people every year about their experiences. So we do have some data about this. And I think the first thing to say by context is that consumer behaviour is evolving all the time for all sorts of reasons. And so, for example, consumers' desire to shop around has actually grown enormously in the 11, 12 years that we've run in the survey. So when we started it, 22% of people were shopping around. Now it's more like 39%. So a real step change there. For people, ease of finding information is really important, but they find that price information, if, for example, which is one of the main drivers for many people, isn't easy to access. And the reports this year is that only maybe about 12 to 15% of people can get the information they want about price from websites, for example. So what we find is that consumers prefer maybe a hybrid approach, face-to-face initially to maybe to generate establish the relationship with the legal service provider, and then being perfectly happy after that to have email updates. So we find actually over 44% of people are happy to kind of have their constant communication by email. They're not concerned about that. They actually value that. Although again, a slight note of caution that 25% who received their service over the last 12 months through email or online would actually have preferred to have more of an opportunity to speak to their lawyer along the way. So they're not only looking for that provision, they do want that kind of mixed economy. A couple of other things I would just say. Unbundling of legal services is growing in popularity. It has done over the last 12 years or so. So this is just where people receive some legal services from professionals and then maybe do other parts of the case themselves. And that is actually aided by digitisation. It's one of the tools that can help people with that. And so, for example, the panel has received a presentation from a firm called Valor. So I'm not particularly endorsing that company as as a particular provider, but it's just that we know about their approach to unbundling and the provision of services using technology in the sector that I actually work in, employment. They've offered a kind of a new range of services, and technology is enabling that. So I think we're finding that face-to-face provision of service is actually kind of plateauing. It was 36% over the last 12 months, whereas it had been 44% during the height of the pandemic, whereas it was 21% in 2012. So there is a long-term growth and change, but it is slightly plateauing maybe. And yeah, I mean, I think those are some of the kind of highlights I point to from our recent tracker survey, certainly.
Thank you, David. It's really interesting from your tracker survey, actually, sort of as you were mentioning, the interface between the transparency rules and tech and innovation, because obviously the two are sort of somewhat complementary, but it'd be interesting coming years to see how that beds in. Jenifer, can I turn to you now? Because I'd love to pick on your experience and ask you, how do you think these insights compare with your experience of considering which technologies to implement and when over the last 3 years? The obvious thing, where the legal services providers, especially on the high street providers, where are they going now?
Yes, sure. And hi, everyone. Great to be with you, and great to see this work and the conversation that it enables. And also, I'm still reading from some of the things that David shared, that 20% of people are not able to get clear information about pricing. Seems to me completely wrong and needs to be addressed. Yes, so, and actually a lot of what I see here and what Tom presented is very congruent with what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing. Although I do think it would have been very interesting to see the data cut in different ways always, right? So, you know, because the legal sector is so diverse, the nature of the work, the nature of client need, the type of firm, etc., all means that their needs on technology are very, very different. The problem that they need to solve for their clients or for themselves in service of their clients, of course, is completely different. And so to some extent, it's hard to generalize. Can I just say one of the things I love is this insight that having been forced to, that there are benefits that are being realized. And I think that is such a fantastic point to make. And it's very typical, of course, in life, right? You've got to get involved and experience something and see the universe of the possible in order to actually evaluate it and harness it. And I think that's something I really hope people take away from this. The other thing I hope people take away is also that since we were forced to do things, that doesn't mean now that we can sit back and coast. Although, of course, there's a consolidation period, which is something I'm seeing as well. For example, I'm seeing people focusing less on making apps, which was trending for a while. And it may be that is because of investment cycles and because of the different priorities that came forward during COVID that meant those things perhaps went on the back burner. And I see that there are a number of people that are wanting to bring those back forward. But the mid-size and larger firms or those serving particularly corporate and civil litigation clients, I think are ahead of what the insights state. And perhaps that's because there's significant pressure from those clients, which is less so in the high street, right? There's probably a bit of a lag there. And I think that's very relevant. I loved the very long bar that said 95% ability to be more responsive to client needs. Please, let's keep focused on that. But otherwise matches what I'm seeing, particularly at the small end of the slides, which talked about distributed ledger, automation, tech-assisted review and things. There's been a lot more investment and research and R&D in larger firms on those things. And of course, since OpenAI in November last year with ChatGPT, the larger firms are all swarming around trying to figure out how to use generative AI. And there's a lot of work happening on chatbots and things like that, which perhaps we could talk about, because I think they've got there's a big impact there potentially in terms of disintermediation for consumers that need access to information but can't get it. So where do they go? They go to environments like that. Will they be well served? Potentially, yes. Would they be even better served by firms and others being able to deploy that technology themselves so that they get an extra layer of personalization in respect of human contact, but also in respect of making sure that the answers that they're getting are correct? The other thing that's not referenced but kind of indirectly is knowledge management is a massive theme for the internals of firm environments. Just handling data and the large scale of change, etc., is a big one. And also, again, implicit, but that isn't specifically stated, is data. Just the ability of firms and legal service providers to be able to understand their world and their clients way better. And that I know is implicit into tech deployment, but it is a slightly different flavor. It requires a slightly different skill set, expertise, and the opportunity there, I think, must not be understated. And then the thing that your asterisks that show about your 4 access categories, one of the things that's been trending for a while in the larger firms or the sort of more commercial environments are what's called front doors, or self-service is another way of describing it. And the in-house community, in-house legal community use this a lot. And that, I think, is that asynchronous way of allowing people to do the thing they need to do on their timing. You know, I'm a small business owner. I finish my day job, as it were, at 7 o'clock. I put the kids to bed and I need to be able to go and do my legal stuff at 9, 10 o'clock at night. That type of thing, I think, is fantastic. And we need to be a lot more aware of that type of usability. And I think one of the things we don't do so well in legal services is user testing. And in the tech world, you wouldn't do anything without user testing, as you, of course, know so well, Kate. And I think the other thing I would just say before I pause, because I may or may not be answering the question in full, but the thing I found surprising and worrying, although maybe it's not really that surprising because we know it, is that approximately 20% of legal service providers are still not on cyber. are still not on cloud, are still not on video, are still not on e-signature or digital ID. These are things which, of course, there's a long tail, but they seem so fundamental to the operation of a legal services organization and also serving the client. So just digital ID is so much easier for a consumer, uploading documents and having things scanned in a digital way, subject to digital exclusion, etc. So I'll pause for a minute, but that's some initial thoughts.
Thanks, Jenifer. No, it was very interesting to, as you say, sort of the just from the basics of video conferencing, just the huge uptake on that, which is such a big shift. But then it's not at all surprising to see predictive technologies and blockchain way down at the lower end. But I do agree that they are being adopted by the larger, more corporate firms. But if they're well adopted and sort of tested, as you say, and the data's right, then there is definitely an opportunity for a flow down to consumer benefits further down the line. Lorena, turning back to you, if you don't mind. It's interesting that there's a perception from the sector that there are these regulatory barriers to exploring or adopting tech adoption. And I think we remember during COVID, obviously, there was almost the joke about whoever owns Zoom and the shares, and the value going up because everyone was hopping on Zoom. But I do remember, that there was a little bit more hesitance about, for example, e-signatures and virtual IDs, which are obviously very practical. And there was some changes, and that's now been something I think law firms have seen is a necessary, and as Jenifer just pointed out, we need to see more of that because it does create a very smooth or much smoother transitional process for onboarding a new client, as an example, to do a new process. These regulatory barriers, real or perceived, are they barriers to exploring adopting tech solutions, and how important is it for the LSB to be encouraging the use of technology to deliver legal services with this background of the regulatory perspective?
I mean, I think the fact that we are publishing guidance which actively encourages the adoption and the promotion of technology and innovation in the delivery of services underlines how important we think it is. The reason it's so important from our perspective is circling back to something that David said earlier about the levels of unmet legal need in the market. We know that there are significant levels of unmet legal need, both for individual consumers, but also for small businesses. And we can see ourselves that, as you've just said, Kate, that the use of technology and innovation is an ideal way to sort of reach those consumers who may otherwise struggle. And so it's, again, just moving back to what you said initially about regulatory barriers and the perception or actual barriers. So in Tom's slides, we saw that from a firm perspective, they're saying that regulatory factors, it depends on whether it's services or technology, but overall, they've declined as a constraint between the two survey waves over the last 4 years. But they are, and so that's good news, obviously, but they are still reported as constraints. So there is clearly still some work to do there. And sort of aside from firms, we do know specifically that innovators experience and perceive regulation to be a barrier when they're trying to bring new solutions into the market. So again, it's doubly important that we work to remove those barriers and address them. But aside from that and sort of looking at specific barriers, I think from our perspective, it's really important that regulation has a bigger overarching role, that it is this positive enabling force that actively encourages adoption where we can see that there's benefits. And then that brings us back full circle to the guidance again, a permissive, open-facing sector that's consumer focused and where regulatory approaches are harmonized across the piece. That, from our point of view, we would really hope would start to, again, reduce that perception of constraints even further and provide more regulatory certainty.
Can I make a comment on that, which is I find really, really important? So typically, if people are coming to work in this sector, they have a real awareness, whether they're regulated or not, of the responsibility that there is. That, a lot of the tech pioneers I've worked with are very aware of, and they're driven by the purpose of supporting people to have a better experience than they currently do, or to drive down cost, or whatever it might be. And the fact that the law has a purpose which is societal only and first and always. And so I think what we've got is a cohort of really responsible people who want to be told that it's okay. So rather than looking at the law and saying, well, there's nothing that stops me doing that, and the regulator doesn't seem to stop me doing that, They want an active, it's okay. And sometimes they go to law firms to get that advice. But actually, I think there is a lot. And of course, that's why we stood up the regulatory response unit at Law Tech UK, because we felt like the other part of it is you've got 11 legal services regulators. That's a really complicated environment for a tech pioneer, for example, to step into. And I think it's interesting to see some in the research, the fact that regulatory basis does seem to have an impact on the type of innovation that people are interested in, and whether people will partner with a law tech or not, and the perception of how their regulator might see that. You know, will I get told off by the SRA if I partner with a law tech to deliver that service? So I think there's a piece here around the perception and hearing from the regulator that we encourage it. But I think there's also more practical things. And I think alongside that, there's probably also something around competence and the requirement for a lawyer in any area to have some level of tech competence. I'm not talking about coding or anything scary, but just to have a level of competence with deploying the correct tooling that is necessary for your clients to receive the benefit of the service correctly.
Yeah, it's a very good point there, Jenifer. I mean, I think that's a very accurate summary that there are lots of new providers coming into the sector. We always need more, obviously, but there are many coming in, and what their perception is of the rules. I mean, I think it's partly, as you say, there are 11 different regulated entities covering the different sectors. I mean, it's a big argument for why overarching policy is coming from the LSB in the way that it is, because it is actually creating a cohesive view to the regulators below. But nevertheless, I mean, I think we're going to shift into the Q&A, and I think actually one of the first questions we've had actually addresses that question rather well from Mr. Mystery, which is there any data difference for the unregulated sector, because they do seem further ahead in terms of tech adoption. And I know, Tom, when we were reviewing the research last week, this exact question came up. Tom, do you want to have a comment on the unregulated sector and where they sit in this?
Yes, happy to. This was probably one of the surprises working through this, because you think, you know, unregulated, unfettered, free reign, off we go. You know, maybe not quite Wild West, but you know, no worries, few cares, and you know, it's all easy. But we don't actually see that, surprisingly. And actually, amongst 150 unregulated firms or organisations involved, they were more likely to introduce only 3 out of those 13 technologies that we asked about, and were more likely to say, compared to the group as a whole, say that it faced constraints. And I think, yeah, that takes a bit more digging, and obviously every good researcher will always say the answer is more research. But beyond that, I think probably, you know, what's happening is that may reflect that obviously, you know, we think unregulated market or sector, it's not one homogenous block that looks very similar. You've got those who are a big, you know, probably have funding from wherever, are using technology, probably exploiting it very well. At the other end, you've got the traditional cottage industry. You know, not exclusively, but will writing is probably a stereotypical example, where it's done on word of mouth. I come to your home, I sit down, I write up my notes, I go away, I come back to you after a couple of calls with a will, and, you know, and it's minimal use of technology on that side. So I think, actually, surprisingly, they're not necessarily the place to look if you're looking further ahead, and actually ABSs are beyond where you might think the unregulated providers are.
Maybe I can just jump in briefly there, because I happen to work in part of the unregulated sector. I work for a third sector legal provider, and so from our experience, I think it's definitely a question of capacity and capability. Actually, we're a very small organisation. Getting the resources to keep the basic service going is a big enough challenge, let alone getting funds to develop in these ways, which we'd dearly love to do. And it was only really by chance, actually, that we put in place the basic technologies that you need to operate remotely just before lockdown happened. Otherwise, you know, it would have been a real problem for us. So I think you're quite right to say that the unregulated sector is it's a real kind of mixture of different kinds of organisations, and certainly speaking from my part of the sector, resourcing is a really big issue.
Thanks, David. Yes, I can imagine it is a huge commitment as well in terms of time and training. Taking on a new software alone, we've all had to do it in legal practice in the past, and I think that is another factor that could be impacting.
Kate, can I make a comment on that, Kate? Because I think this is
please.
really massive. So, and I saw this in some of the research data around, you know, it's training, but it's also access to specialists, and it's also access to somebody who can think the thoughts in the first place. You know, if your main specialism, of course, is giving legal advice or some form of legal service, then it's off the side of your desk to even think about operationally how things might be different. So I do think there's something, we've seen this in universities, for example, when one particular person of a particular specialism or ability to build a community or innovative focus steps into a university environment, then there's a hub that starts to be created around them, and then they bring other people together. We saw this in financial services in the Khalifa Review, and the opportunity for connectivity. So I do think there's something about connectivity, collaboration, respectful of the fact that some people in the survey have said that collaboration has not served them well, or they didn't have the benefits that they wanted from collaboration. But I do think it's access to specialists. So in the way that we've got you know, lists of lawyers, but we don't have lists of data scientists, legal engineers, legal design people. And I'm not saying that the LSB would endorse something like that, but they could support with the crowdsourcing of those types of lists. People who are used to working in this environment.
I'm sure I heard the phrase, I can't remember if it's accurate, like not a unicorn as in a type of successful startup, but a unicorn as in a person who possesses these 4 key qualities. And it's very rare for one person to have all 4. So I remember we did an AI project and I had 1 or 2 of the qualities. But do you remember what those qualities were and how rare it is? And as you say, it does mean you have to collaborate, doesn't it, to find the 4 qualities together to successfully embed and new technology.
Or even to think about it in the first place. My amazing high street firm that do conveyancing, probate, these types of things, they just would never even think those thoughts. They're too busy just trying to serve their client community. And I think that's part of it, is how do we support them to connect with people so they can even have the space to think about that in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, that is a big challenge alongside everyday legal provision, let alone in the pro bono or third sector, because, you know, as we all know, funding is one of the biggest pressures there. Do we have any other questions that have come in from our audience? I think we have. Oh, no, we have. Thank you. From Gerald Hodgkinson. How deeply have you drilled down into potential attitudinal barriers? We may have just touched on it there. Are you monitoring specific attitudes or merely asking at the highest level to what extent attitudinal barriers in general are a concern? I ask because the recent survey of solicitors my team, University of Manchester and UCL, undertook with the help of the Law Society, revealed marked variations depending on the specific issues addressed by the attitude statements. That's one for Jenifer, I feel. That's right in your lap.
This is just so, Gerard, I'm with you. I'm completely with you. And I think it's hard. I'm sure it's hard to address. And I think part of this, I go back to the fact that, and I had this at Law Tech UK when I was looking across the entire sector, it's a very diffuse, diverse community. You know, the client communities are very diverse as well. So I think attitudes, to the extent that you can have a thematic approach, is very, very interesting. But I'd be even more interested in looking at it much more in cohorts. So for the people who are serving, you know, the high street firms of this type of needs of clients, what are their attitudes? I think we'd need to look at it from that point of view. I'd also love, it would be amazing if you could come off the mic and talk about it too, because I do think there is, at the point, sort of evidences it that since you've been forced as a community to adopt a range of technologies, therefore you have been able to see that they are of value to you. If we'd been able to beforehand look at attitudes, which actually we had at Law Tech UK, a lot of it is emotional, cultural, you know, my experience before, I just feel uncomfortable with tech because I'm not really very techy. I think all of those play into it, but this is why I come back to what is the purpose of law, and what does competence actually require. So we have to get over the concerns that we might have to have a go, but of course we need help to make sure that we're doing it in a responsible way.
Definitely
Well,
agree.
I've been unmuted, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think we really do need to drill down quite deeply. I mean, what we found in our survey, just to give you some quick headlines, for example, pretty well everyone in our survey could see the business benefits to law tech adoption, but how's it going to benefit their careers? Not at all convinced. How's it going to benefit their pay and promotion prospects? Not at all convinced. How far do we see gaps, for example, between current levels of provision and what they would want to be providing, ideally? Enormous. So we have to ask very specific questions. It's not enough to just say to what extent are attitudinal barriers in the abstract a concern. That will elicit very different kinds of responses from when you drill down to specific issues that we have to go through issue by issue, I think, to get a more nuanced picture of what's really going on.
And Gerard, this to me comes back to competence as well, because if I've got intrinsic and extrinsic pressures upon me, or you know, influences upon me, which I do in my practice, you know, my competence requirement is non-specific in respect to this, then I will just defer to the current status quo and how I'm surviving. I won't be encouraged to advance or push beyond my comfort zone or do something beyond my day job. And that's where I think as a community, we need to be looking at service in the context, in a way more purpose-driven way, I think. And I know that's very hard when people are busy, but I agree with you.
Yeah, great.
Just to say very briefly, fully agree with that. And you know, out of curiosity alone, I would love to go much further into that than we can do in this survey to keep it short enough. As I say, it's already a telephone survey to be able to get people to stay to the end and give us as much information we can get out of them as possible. We did sort of have a few, not many, but a few open questions about, you know, where they see things going, as you saw some of those quotes at the end, but also around those regulatory barriers, for example, and those were open responses. And to be honest, some of it was sort of immediate cost benefit analysis. You know, people going, right, well, it's not obviously broken at the moment. Yes, it's tomorrow's or next year's problem. Yes, I know I probably need to come to it, but actually it's not at the top of the list of things that need to happen today, tomorrow. And not all, but one or two of the smaller providers, you know, well, yes, I can fix this, or actually I can just coast to retirement and then it's not my problem and I'm done. It's not worth, you know, that effort to get over all that friction to get to that other place.
Completely understandable.
Thanks, Tom. I wanted to find out, there was one more question I wanted to put to David about certain areas of law or types of consumer that might be best served by the adoption of tech solutions. Do you have any thoughts on that, David? That'd be great to hear.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's probably fair to say that transactional legal work lends itself more to technology solutions, which, you know, makes perfect sense, rather contentious. But actually, even contentious, a lot of the answer, I think, comes down to relationship building. And you can run contentious work using technology solutions. You know, they might be appropriate for, you know, for parts of the process, and you should think about the where they do add value. But I would direct people's attention back again to the SRA segmentation research, which was published last week, which I think is insightful. And I think one of the points that makes is that you can actually change people's levels of confidence and abilities by giving them information. So if you have a chance to look at the research, you'll see there were some interventions which were taken, which actually change people's levels of confidence just by giving them certain kinds of information. So I think you don't have to kind of surrender and just say, well, it's those people or it isn't those people, because you can actually make a difference and make it a dynamic situation.
Yeah,
may I add something to this too?
Oh,
I think sometimes it can be useful to not only look at client need, but the type of activity that technology could be deployed to. So if there is document preparation, document review, if there is preparation of case files. David mentioned Valor earlier in the employment space, fantastic product. So it, for example, helps you DIY the chronology of the case of an employment dispute and put your case file together. Like, that's the type of thing that is of great value to a lawyer to then be on the receiving end of. Oh, fantastic, you've used Valor, I'm now receiving that, so now we can go forward together. You're better onboarded to this process and you have the documentation in an order that actually is more affordable for you to have done it through Valor than for me to be doing it for you as a lawyer. So I think looking at the types of activities that people would need, whether or not it's a SME or a person, a regular person, for example.
That's really interesting. I must admit, bundle preparation is my personal sort of fear factor task, and it takes a huge amount of time, and it's actually just really collation of lots of repetitive documents and making sure that numbering and everything is correct, and really that's a waste of an expensive lawyer's time. So if there are products out there, I'd certainly be interested. I mean, it does certainly seem as if the pandemic has been a real change driver. I mean, it's interesting to think about whether that change is being maintained or whether it's plateaued, but this research does seem to suggest that it's acted as a sort of threshold through which a lot of firms have come, and they've now successfully adopted, at the very least, video tech and some e-signatory and ID checking. So it is, at least in terms of conversations and research from 2018, we have moved on a long way, and this has been a really interesting and fascinating discussion around this. I think we are now coming towards the end of our lovely session today. I'm so glad all of you did manage to join us and share these insights from this latest research. I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. I want to thank Tom, Jenifer, David and Lorena for your insights as well. It's been really, really useful. If any of you have any questions at all about the survey findings or LSB research ongoing, please contact our team at research@legalservicesboard.org.uk. I think that will pop on screen at some point. And I'd like to highlight that registrations for our annual conference in March next year are now open. Please visit the Reshaping Legal Services website to register your interest, and I'll hopefully look forward to seeing all of you or some of you there. But once again, thanks everyone for joining us. Take care all.